Have you heard of flu or pox parties? This is basically where a bunch of kids are placed together with the goal of exposing them to infectious diseases, things like chickenpox, measles, even COVID. Yeah, that's not recommended. Vaccination is much safer and more effective, but this video isn't about that. It is about filth parties, but parties about a disease that wasn't even infectious. It's a pretty rare disease, maybe one you haven't even heard of, because it's not really around that much anymore, at least not in North America. The disease I'm talking about is pellagra. So pellagra was first noticed in 18th century Spain and Italy. Doctors started to notice that patients had dry, flaky red skin, hence pellagra, a disease of the skin. This dry red skin was mostly on areas that were prone to sun exposure. Your cheeks, you'd have this butterfly type rash on the backs of your hands, on your feet, but you also had other symptoms, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and you also developed psychiatric symptoms, confused, tired, depressed. It got so bad that you could even experience psychosis, and many patients ended up being admitted to asylums with so-called pellagrous insanity. This constellation of symptoms is what medical students today might memorize as the 4 Ds: dermatitis, dementia, diarrhea, and death. So what actually caused this illness? It was a mystery for quite a long time. The leading theory was that it had an infectious cause. Remember that germ theory was taking hold by the beginning of the 20th century. So the idea that some kind of microbe, bacteria, was responsible for this illness and that it was transmissible, communicable, was not unreasonable. People also started to think that there was a microbe or fungus associated with corn because a lot of people that were suffering had corn as a staple in their diet. So I talked about how it was initially noticed in Europe, but people started to notice it in the early 20th century. 1902 was the time that the first case was reported in the United States, and this was in the American South. Doctors were still going on with this infectious theory and were trying to associate it to people's diets. Doctors also started to notice that pellagra mostly spread and was most common among poorer areas, so they tried to make these arguments about poor sanitation and hygiene in the area and how this spread the disease. But it wasn't until an infectious disease specialist, Dr. Joseph Goldberger, came onto the scene that people started to figure out what was going on. He noticed that in institutions like asylums, the patients would be sick, specifically the poorer patients, but the nurses, the staff, the doctors wouldn't be. And that's kind of strange, isn't it? I mean, if there's an infectious illness, it's affecting everybody. We started to wonder what was going on. Dr. Joseph Goldberger was not convinced that there was some bug causing pellagra, even though literally everybody else was. Instead, he started to wonder if it was related to a so-called poverty diet, that is the 3 M's: meat, cornmeal, and molasses. People in the South, especially poorer people, didn't really have access to fresh food, fresh milk, fresh eggs, vegetables. And this was especially true of people living in institutions, so asylums, jails, orphanages. And so Goldberger started to think, what if people were just eating a nutritionally deficient diet? What if there's some vitamin that was missing? It's also worth taking a moment to think about the American South in the beginning of the 20th century. Cotton was the crop du jour, so to speak, and so priority was given to cash crops like cotton rather than growing nutritionally rich crops that could be used as food. Even the corn that people were eating that was a staple of their diet wasn't always locally grown. It was brought in from the Midwest, and because of the way it was milled, it was processed, it was actually less nutritionally rich than alternatives that were locally grown. We've already recognized how politicians and doctors of the period were immensely resistant to the idea that pellagra was caused by socioeconomic circumstances. Even when they admitted and recognized that it was caused by poverty, blame was still placed on the sufferers, the victims of the disease itself. There was this idea that they had so-called intrinsic innate characteristics that caused them to be susceptible to this illness. The pathogen explanation that relied on germ theory was easy. It was an easy out, and it avoided messy conversations about race and the economic circumstances of the American South. It hid the reality of this new American South that was touted as a very prosperous area. So Goldberger was really fighting hard to change this perception of pellagra, and what he started to do was actually feed people in institutions nutritionally dense foods. This would confirm his hypothesis that really pellagra was all about the food that you were eating or weren't eating. He still couldn't pry this infectious theory out of people's hands, so he had to switch tactics, and some of them were ethically questionable. One of the experiments took place in a Mississippi prison. He found a bunch of inmates, isolated them so that they didn't get sick from anything else to confound his experiment, and then he controlled their diet. He fed them meat, cornmeal, and molasses to see if they would develop pellagra. Half of them did after a few months of this monotonous diet, and they described themselves as being miserable. But this still wasn't enough to convince people. He was like, all right, a new plan. And so what he tried to do was deliberately infect himself with pellagra and ultimately show that it wasn't infectious. And this is where these filth parties come into the picture. Goldberger collected samples from patients, samples of their skin, of their urine, feces, and then combined it with flour to form some kind of pill that could be ingested. A bunch of volunteers did this for a few months. And guess what? They didn't develop pellagra. So after all of this, were people convinced? Not really. It still took a lot of work from many physicians like Henry Morgan Green, as well as researchers years to figure out the cause of pellagra and finally change people's minds. This happened in the 1930s, unfortunately after Goldberger's death, when researchers finally determined that the cause of pellagra was a vitamin B3 deficiency, that of niacin. And so into the 1940s in the US, laws were passed to ensure the enrichment and fortification of grains and bread with niacin in order to prevent pellagra, which also happens to bring us to the history of Wonder Bread.